Okay, so this video will talk through some possible quotations that you could use to explore the character of Benvolio. So if this came up in an exam, these are some things that you could include in your answer. By no means is this the only way that you can answer a question on Benvolio, but this just gives you some ideas of some aspects of his character. Um, so to begin with, I always think if you have a character question, it's always a good start in your first paragraph to start, or sorry, your first main body paragraph. You should have an introduction before that. To focus on the audience's initial impression. This helps show or demonstrate your knowledge of the play as well and how that character develops over time. So you'd also get points here for if it's Edexcel, it'd be AO1, your knowledge and understanding of the play. It may be something different if you have a different exam board. So you might argue that our initial impression of Benvolio is that he's a peacemaker. First of all, the name Benvolio translates into well-wisher. So already his name is really quite symbolic of the character that he is supposed to represent. He hopes for peace. He's a peacemaker. And we see that in the first time we hear dialogue from him. So just a reminder, in Act 1, Scene 1, it opens with that a scene in Verona, in the streets of Verona, with the Capulets and Montagues starting a fight with one another. And he enters the scene and says, "Part fools, put up your swords." So if you were going to look at the language here, you'd want to focus on the use of imperative verbs. So we've got part and put. So we know that he is someone who is in authority. He feels like he is in a position where he can tell the servants of the households to step away. So we know that he does have authority. This, you could argue, is supported also by the fact that he uses exclamations. Okay, so he's incredibly passionate about stopping this fight as well. So this is really important to him. Just to clarify, because I know sometimes this is misunderstood, put up your swords means to surrender. So if you point your sword at someone, you are showing you are willing to fight. So to put up your sword is actually to show that you surrender. So what we learn here is, not only is he a peacemaker, he has authority, he has power, he's of a higher social standing, and he chooses to use that authority to hopefully bring peace, which you might argue is in contrast to other characters such as Tybalt, who we'll come to now. In this scene we also see Tybalt, and this is a fantastic way that Shakespeare has used both characters for contrast, and in this instance, because we're focusing on Benvolio, you might argue that Tybalt is used to highlight what a good person Benvolio is. While Benvolio says, "I do but keep the peace," in contrast, so another technique here that you could mention, in contrast, Tybalt says, "I hate the word." You might even argue that they are the antithesis of one another. And Shakespeare's really created two direct opposites to encourage the audience, you might argue, to respect and like Benvolio and to greatly dislike Tybalt, who will later be killed by Romeo. Another good reason why Shakespeare wants Tybalt to be hated. So in yellow is how you could link this to context. So violence was rife in Verona at the time the play was set, and deadly battles were fought over petty differences. So this wouldn't have been that unusual at the time. And not to forget as well, Shakespeare is trying to open the scene to kind of prepare the audience for a violent play, an impulsive, violent play as well. And to entertain his audience, of course. Moving on, we then notice that Benvolio is not only a peacemaker, he's incredibly loyal, he's a very good friend. We see him comfort his cousin Romeo. So instantly, what you might want to mention is his first interaction with Romeo. At the beginning, you notice that they share the same or similar number of lines. So that shows that they are each other's equals, they have respect for each other, they get on. But later, when we get to Romeo discussing how heartbroken he is over Rosaline, or Rosaline, he really goes off on one with all those oxymorons about how terrible love is. And Benvolio lets him go ahead and explain his emotions and his express his emotions to Benvolio. So we learn that he's a very good listener as well. He really does care for Romeo, and he gives him an opportunity to really share his deep feelings. And we know he hasn't been sharing those with his parents. He's been locking himself away. So Romeo really trusts Benvolio. He doesn't open up to anyone else really other than Friar Lawrence about his heartbreak. And what does he do? He tries to comfort Romeo. He tells him to compare her face to some that I will show. In other words, I'll show you other girls, and you'll soon get over Rosaline. I will make thee think thy swan a crow. Now, what you could do is see this as really just a friend trying to comfort his other friend, okay? Think about how you might comfort a friend if they're going through a heartbreak. Oh, believe me, once you meet someone else, you'll realise they were nobody, okay? So you can just read it in that way. Is this just a friend who is simply comforting someone else? You could, however, argue that this is kind of very typical of a male perspective of that time in the Elizabethan times. So if we look at the context here, we've got family links were important to the Elizabethans, who would expect loyalty and close-knit bonds between cousins. So we definitely see that close-knit bond. Romeo feels comfortable to open up to Benvolio, and also we can see that Benvolio is really trying to comfort Romeo and help him move on so that he can get over his heartbreak with Rosaline. However, we also notice that potentially this is quite a sexist opinion held by Benvolio, but it's really important to consider the fact that this wasn't that unusual at that time. So women were commonly viewed as the lesser sex, and marriage among the wealthy was a means to obtain or maintain their power and wealth. So that really kind of encouraged a superficial view of love. Love wasn't really something that blossomed over time. It wasn't anything that was that deep and meaningful, especially for the wealthy. It was a way to maintain your money, okay? You wanted to make sure that you married someone of a similar status so that you could gain property or whatever other means. So yes, he does have sexist views, but I think it's really important to appreciate that this wouldn't have been seen as that uncommon for the times. Unfortunately, as well-meaning as Benvolio is, hence his name, Well-Wisher, he is the catalyst to the Greek tragedy, the tragic end, of course that being Romeo and Juliet committing suicide. Who is it that encourages Romeo to go to the party? And obviously eventually he then meets Juliet. It's Benvolio. Benvolio says, go thither. Okay, look at the imperative. He's really encouraging Romeo. And star-crossed lovers here is just a reminder of what was mentioned in the prologue. Romeo and Juliet are described as star-crossed. It's in their fate. It is their destiny to be with each other. But they're also death-marked. And Shakespeare uses Benvolio as a catalyst for this. Benvolio unwittingly paves the way to their death. Doesn't mean to, he only wants to help Romeo, but actually it's his actions that mean they meet. And the Elizabethan audience would have strongly believed in fate and destiny, so they wouldn't have looked at Benvolio and held him accountable because they believed, no, this is part of the destiny, we're not in control of, we don't have such thing as free will. So then they wouldn't blame Benvolio for the deaths of Romeo and Juliet, but they would see his part as very important in their fate. And then eventually we can talk about him being really trusted as well. So once Romeo kills Tybalt, who is it that Prince Escalus turns to? None other than Benvolio. He asks Benvolio who began this bloody fray. So the fact that that comes from someone of a high social standing, someone with authority, and he decides to turn to Benvolio, tells us that he was seen as an honourable person, someone who could be trusted. He's turning to Benvolio for the truth. So he believes he is an honest man. And so does Benvolio. Benvolio says, this is the truth or let Benvolio die. So he relays everything that happens. You might argue that this is quite hyperbolic to say, if this isn't the truth, then kill me. Does he really mean that? So he's being quite hyperbolic. But I think it's really to stress his integrity. That's very important to him. So his honesty, his loyalty, his integrity is clearly very important. Hence why he says it in that way. Now, if you want to be critical in this, you might question actually his integrity. So while he is recounting what happens between Romeo and Tybalt, as well as Mercutio, he refers to Tybalt as deaf to peace, which we could definitely see that we've noticed right at the beginning. He said he hates the word. But he refers to Mercutio as bold. He almost makes Mercutio sound like a martyr or a hero. So there is an element of bias because Mercutio is just as much to blame. If anything, he was really antagonistic in this moment as well. The fight was not between him and Tybalt, it was between him and Romeo, and it was Mercutio who stepped in and wanted to fight. But he doesn't really mention that. He does hold back some information. So actually, his recount of the situation is biased. So what might that tell you? Does that just highlight that even the characters with the most integrity, the most honest, the ones that want peace, are affected by this feud in some way, that it's so deeply embedded? Remember, it's referred to as an ancient grudge. It is so deeply embedded within the society, within the different families, that it's even impossible for someone like Benvolio, who is a well-wisher, to really be unaffected by this feud. And that kind of highlights how deeply ingrained this hatred is. What could you link here? You could start linking it to duelling and how it was, how it would have been considered really something quite noble by Elizabethan England. So duelling was a means by which conflicts were resolved amongst noblemen. It was illegal, however, it was still considered quite honourable to do. So the violence within this scene might shock a modern audience much more than a member of the Elizabethan audience. But I think more importantly, it'd be great for you to question the integrity even of Benvolio at the end of this play.